Welcome to the New York Society Library. I am Sayre Holliday from the library staff, and I'm just here briefly to welcome you and mention a couple of points. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. I want to let you know that tonight's event is being live streamed and photographed. If I could ask you to silence your phone or anything that might make an unwanted sound, that would be great. If you're new to the library, we are celebrating our 270th anniversary this month even. In addition to our large collection of books and other materials, beautiful reading spaces, children's library, and other services, we offer a full season of events with authors and other presenters, so do take a look at what's coming up. We'd also like to thank the sponsors of tonight's event, Polymath Educational Services, providing personalized support for teens with learning differences. Our book collections include, we hope, at least a little bit of everything, but one of our great strengths is literature, literary fiction, and literature in translation. We've been collecting the works of Robert Musil since at least the middle of the 20th century. We pulled a few older editions over here, and we're glad to have the excellent recent translations from Contramundum Press on our shelves as well. Tonight's event is a celebration of over a decade of Contramundum's publication of Musil. Our sincere thanks to Contramundum for bringing us tonight's program and our three distinguished presenters. Our thanks also to Nicholas Burns for making this evening possible. Speaking of our three distinguished presenters, I'll just briefly let you know, Rudiger Campe is a professor at Yale University, where he regularly teaches a seminar on Musil and the modern novel. He is the recipient of the Humboldt Research Prize and the A.B. Warburg Prize, author of The Game of Probability, Literature and Calculation from Pascal and Kleist, among other works. Genese Grill is the author of The World as Metaphor in Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, Possibility as Reality, translator and editor of 4 books of Musil's writings with Contramundum Press, and co-translator with Samantha Rose Hill of What Remains, the collected poetry of Hannah Arendt. Her collection of essays, Portals, Reflections on the Spirit in Matter, was published in 2023. She's currently working on the first English-language biography of Robert Musil for Yale University Press, and it's expected to be published year after next, if I understand correctly. Mark Mirsky is the author of 13 books, among them 5 novels and a book of stories and novellas. He served as the editor in the English translation of Robert Musil's diaries. He's also been the editor since its founding in 1972 of Fiction, one of the prime venues for the publication of Musil's translations for over 2 decades. He's taught at Stanford University and Bar Ilan, as well as serving as director of the City College MA and then as chairperson of its English department. We have copies of Ms. Grill's translations from Musil for sale downstairs this evening from Contramundum Press, so do please take a look at those on your way out or after the presentation. And I am now honored to hand the stage to Dr. Mirsky. Enjoy.
Not doctor, professor.
Professor Mirsky. I'm honored to hand the stage to Professor Mirsky.
I hold my degree from the Board of Education. I am a humble MA holder, MFA holder. So Thayer has introduced Genese, and basically stole my first sentence, but here it is. You'll have to pardon me, I'm between cataract surgeries, and so I think that these glasses are still working, but I may stumble here and there. I've worked closely with Genese Grill, who's invited me to speak about Robert Musil, both on my introduction to the diaries of Robert Musil, and as the editor of Fiction, where we published Genese's translations of Musil's stories, letters, plays, and most important, her critical notes. What I can contribute, I can only do so from my experience as a novelist and a teacher. I was introduced to Genese by the late Burton Pike, who wrote that Musil in his essays, quote, demands that the reader participate in their ongoing thoughts rather than simply observe them from the outside. The reader is expected to catch and be caught up in the emotional nimbus of ideas. Those sentences now echo to me of Ralph Waldo Emerson's cry in his Phi Beta Kappa address for, quote, creative readers. There is then creative reading as well as creative writing when the mind is braced by labor and invention. The page of whatever book we read becomes luminous with manifold illusions. Emerson. So my only disagreement with Pike, who was so often my guide, was his disdain for Henry David Thoreau. Though I shared his admiration for Thoreau's mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and so did Musil. Genese, who wrote her doctoral thesis with Burton, generously shared a draft with me. That thesis radically altered my perspective on Musil. I was made aware of Musil's fascination with mystical sources and his use of Martin Buber's 1909 anthology, Ecstatic Confessions. That Musil should have absorbed the Jewish philosopher Buber's anthology, which includes Jewish mystics but draws from a wide world of other mystics. What became, according to one critic, Musil's Bible, whetted my curiosity. I had been changed in my own very personal reading of Gershom Sholom's masterwork, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, in the wake of my mother's death in 1968. Others like Harold Bloom, the Yale critic, have been changed by Sholom as well. In my last conversation with Jorge Luis Borges, he spoke about Sholom's influence on us both. As someone with some background in Jewish scholarship, I found Musil's fascination with mysticism at one with his fascination with Jews, Jewish sources, and Jews of all persuasion, assimilated, half assimilated, or entirely assimilated into German or Austrian culture. Musil sounds my own questions about Jewish identity. I read many pages of The Man Without Qualities as a notebook of stories and anecdotes on that subject. It's hard to avoid his hero Ulrich's entanglements in Man Without Qualities with its Jewish and half-Jewish characters. Musil's wife, Martha, seems to have come from an assimilated Jewish family, but I await Genese's forthcoming biography of Musil, in which she promises to write extensively about Martha Musil. The link between Musil's mystical tendencies and his curiosity about the psychology of Jewish men who thought of themselves as thoroughly assimilated into a rational German or Austrian society, but were troubled by its racist stereotypes, in particular of their gentle wives and children, spoke to questions of my own. His focus on the half-Jewish daughter, Gerda Fischel, of such a marriage, and her attraction to an idealistic, cloudy, clearly anti-Semitic young man is radical and brings Ulrich to the border of rape. In the midst of The Man Without Qualities stands the opponent and rival of Ulrich, its Austrian hero, a figure easily identified as a fictional portrait of the German Jewish financier Rathenau, who played such a large part in the German economy before his assassination after the First World War. A reader cannot ignore Musil's choice to resurrect this representative Jew, wildly successful as a businessman, with an international reputation, writing philosophical texts armed with impeccable manners and dress. This is Arnheim, Ulrich's rival for the sexual favors of Musil's beautiful Ulrich's beautiful cousin, Diotima. An imposing public figure, Rathenau, in the person of Arnheim, is portrayed as the opposite of Musil's doppelganger, Ulrich, who's a mathematician, and his shadow, the author, a social critic and mystic. But the attraction in the novel between Ulrich and Arnheim is unmistakable, though their contest all but disappears in part 3 and the furthest reaches of the book, where Ulrich and Musil's real opposite seems to be his sister Agatha. This young woman who appears as if out of nowhere after we have read 725 pages in its English translation, where a more conventional novelist would have wound up the plot and gone on to the next book. One prominent critic of Musil insisted in his review of the diaries in its English edition on reading Musil from a purely political perspective. Politics, however, is as mythical and myth-making a world as fiction. As an avid reader of rabbinic fantasy and as a novelist attracted to mystical journeys in literature, Gilgamesh, Homer, Dante, what's so awesome about Musil is not just that he was a man with so many qualities, but that he seriously researched so many different worlds, that he thought as a scientist, a sociologist, a psychologist, a mystic, a poet. Some of his wit and poetry is lost in translation, but his riddles pass through the barriers of other languages, in my case, English. He has an uncanny intuition in all these fields or worlds. He travels past the carefully plotted fiction in which he had his first success, Young Törless, to the stories in Unions, then the 3 additional stories in a less intense prose in 5 Women, and the feuilletons he publishes in newspapers. He may seem to be going backward from Unions in these later works, but I think now that he's practicing a way of bringing the difficult experiments of the first 2 stories with the 3 later ones, less strenuous stories that he published in 5 Women. He accomplished in them a clearer narrative line, but the mystical stories are the first 2 published in Unions. All of his previous work colors the first chapters of The Man Without Qualities. Here, as Musil writes in his diaries, the author is staring far into the future. His work is more relevant today than in the past. Nothing creaks, though those addicted to fault-finding will find ample grounds for outrage. Despite an ear with a dictionary for laughter in German, Yiddish, Italian, French, and Hebrew, I am still confined to English. Yet I hear Musil's laughter, the pleasure with which he tortures himself, the depth of his intuition about how the social worlds of Germany and Austria before the First and Second World Wars harbored deep prejudices and resented the challenge of outsiders to the reigning autocracy. In those vanished worlds, it was the large Jewish minority in both cultures, not just its assimilated members, but the servants it drew from the rural districts of the empire, who were always the outsiders, a role that Musil confessed he identified with. Like Kafka, Musil was fascinated by the Orthodox Jewish world, where mysticism was still alive in the villages. And so the female servant who comes from that world into Diotima's household is as intense an object of Musil's scrutiny as the assimilated but conflicted Gerda, the half-Jewish daughter of Ulrich's friend, the Jewish banker Leo Fischl. Ulrich, in frustration, comes close to raping Gerda as if to sever the Pythian knot of her knotted desires and repugnance for sexual unions. Of course, that's a terrible crime in Musil's work, and Gerda almost gets very brutally punished for it. I was wholly immersed in Musil's work at the time of the publication of the diaries. But what attracted me to him? What draws me back to teach him again and again? Teaching is a dry task for a novelist unless you are unraveling another's work to understand it better or to find yourself. I urged Genese Grill a few years ago to write a new translation of the story which lit my enthusiasm for Musil's work, The Completion of Love. That story was a welcome intrusion into my own thoughts. The translation by Ethne Wilkins, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Ernst Kaiser omitted a crucial few lines and has been superseded by Genese's translation, but not the introduction to Five Women by Frank Kermode. The latter ranked Musil's work with Joyce, a brother spirit I found reading Portrait of the Artist in high school, then the Dubliners and Ulysses at Harvard and at graduate school. I only discovered Robert Musil's work at the beginning of the 1970s because of my friendship with the Swiss novelist Max Frisch and his wife Mariana, who both joined us in founding the magazine Fiction. My mentor at Harvard and Stanford, Professor Albert J. Gerard, was unaware of Musil, as were most of the influential academic critics compiling the popular anthologies of 20th century fiction. Like Joyce Carol Oates, I discovered Thoreau at 15 and was dazed. There's an essay of hers about that which articulates my own thrill at 14 discovering Thoreau. As a boy of 13 or 14, I'd read about Kafka and his reputation as the most difficult of 20th century writers. Happily, his work was easy to find and purchase. Musil's was not, as some of you may know. You had to somehow get hold of the English edition of Into the Millennium to even know that Agatha existed at one point. Off to that at other points. Okay. There's an essay of hers that articulates my own thrill at 14 discovering Thoreau. I'll explain this obsession with Thoreau and Kafka in a minute. As a boy of 13 or 14, I'd read about Kafka and his reputation as the most difficult of 20th century writers. Happily, his work was easy to find and purchase, so I spent a summer lying on the sands of our beach colony, probing the secrets of the Metamorphosis, at the very moment when a terrible case of adolescent acne was making my face a mass of welts, pimples, and swelling that made Gregor's case a sympathetic one. One Jewish princess of my own age, but taller, unattainable, gloating in a newly filled bikini, stopped by my blanket in the glare of the sunlight to inquire what I was reading. About a man who turns into a cockroach. I watched her scurry away. Something of that teasing I encountered in the early pages of the diaries, when Musil turns to the young dancer whose favors are for sale and sets her on edge, suggesting that he may be the local serial killer. When the Frisches confirmed in the early 70s that Musil was a master in the vein of Joyce, Proust, Kafka, I knew I had to read him. It was at the very moment when I fell in love with a young Norwegian woman. The erotic truths that these early stories of Musil expounded struck a chord of such resonance that I began to search for whatever I could read of his work just as a child, hypnotized by the Pied Piper. Proust, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Faulkner, Flann O'Brien, Baldwin are among the generations before me that I return to go and live afresh in, and closer contemporaries now like Joyce Carol Oates and my friend, the late Donald Barthelme. I never got to ask Donald whether he read and liked Robert Musil. His editor, Roger Angel, was unaware of it, and I've lost touch with Mariana Frisch. Harold Brodkey worshipped Musil, however, and glowed as the early pages of the diaries were published in fiction. Only a few of the short stories which garnered so much attention for Harold's work touch me. But there are tormented passages in his novel, The Runaway Soul, that have the same brutal honesty of self-dissection that Musil practices and shows the latter's influence on Harold. And it's Harold who told me that Donald was intrigued by Musil's obsession with the brutal serial killer Moosbrugger in The Man Without Qualities. The writers I truly love, let me get that away from that mic. The writers I truly love are those I go back to again and again, knowing I will learn something more from them. I teach Musil again and again, as I do Kafka and Thoreau. The fact that Kafka and Musil were aware of each other that Musil, as an editor, should have solicited Kafka for work when the latter was relatively unknown is telling. As I read through the new translation of Kafka's Diaries by Ross Benjamin, I felt again what makes Franz Kafka so important in my life. I'm reminded of Musil's influences as well, the way the latter stares into the questions of one's life. The possibility of a life in another world. The abrupt shock when we come to the limits of our understanding. Both novelists struggle with the difficulty of finding a metaphor that preserves some of the joy of existence while doing justice to the cruelty of death. There's comedy at the end of Kafka's The Trial, but no hope. There's something different in Musil, an ecstatic eroticism promising a form of sexual union in the other world, or as Musil seemed to understand it, quoting him, the other condition. This is the Kabbalah of the 13th century Zohar. Kafka and Musil are both reaching to the unknown in their work, but Musil is the bolder of the two, perhaps because of Martha and the happiness he found in a partner with whom he could share his complex sexual life, who laid bare her own secret life to him with an eager and challenging truth. What seems clear is that Martha was fascinated by herself as a woman, willing to share that fascination with Robert, while he seemed to have found a passage into another world by imagining himself in Martha's body. Of course, he was in Martha's body. I didn't come to that realization till right now. The passage out of oneself into another is not a fiction, Robert Musil's The Completion of Life, or The Temptation of Quiet Veronica. Is Musil's mysticism of the body leading him to the solution of Dante's Commedia in its final last canto, the Paradiso, a dissolution where body and mind dissolve into the thrill of a union with the unimaginable universe, or with the unimaginable God. Kermode's introduction to Five Women promised what I want from fiction, a transformation of myself, a way to inhabit the world of the writer and find myself wrapped in the story. Those two stories of unions, the temptation of Quiet Veronica, the perfecting of, which Genese translates as the completion of love, prepared me to live in the pages of The Man Without Qualities. All three are finally about unions or transformations in reality. As Kermode wrote in his introduction, quote, "They are elaborate attempts to use fiction for its true purposes, the discovery and registration of the human world. As with all works of genius, they suggest a map of reality with an orientation at first strange and unfamiliar. And though it's true that the experience of The Man Without Qualities is one involving a more permanent change of consciousness in the reader, these works, the works of unions, also require his serious attention. I've taught The Man Without Qualities, or parts of it, in graduate classes. It's frustrating. And despite a number of weeks in class devoted to the 2-volume Knopf edition, impossible to accomplish in 4 months. Yet worth it to feel the excitement of students discovering their own mysteries in part 1 and 2, and to register the violent shift when suddenly, without warning, Ulrich's sister Agatha enters the novel. There is still as much of a surprise to me in this as it was when I first reached part 3, into the millennium. As Musil leaves the political world to observe not the dalliance of Ulrich and the women attracted to him, but the dance of attraction between a brother and sister, uniquely matched, he draws me into the uncanny world of the spirit, where the forbidden exercises its spell. For my undergraduates, however, The Completion of Love, which suggests that there is a spiritual constituent to a deliberate crossing into the territory of the forbidden, is enough of a challenge. Musil's riddle of a wife's deliberate adultery is not easy to assimilate for students beginning to write literary fiction, often from very pious backgrounds. Last year, I assigned a feuilleton Musil published in the Berliner Tageblatt in December of 1930 about a young girl he saw on a city trolley years before, accompanied by a man whom Musil guessed may have been her father or brother. He gives us the charged details of an adolescent in a woman's clothes, poised between childhood, ready to bud into a woman's body. Musil's fixed eye on her and his musing years later about whether she ever looks back as a woman upon those moments of adolescence brought outrage from several young women in the class. They saw the author stalking a girl of 13 or 14 inappropriately by just describing her. It caught me off guard. And it took some pains to explain that it all took place in the writer's imagination, many years after he'd seen that girl. To teach even a short piece like this properly, one has to introduce students to Musil's biography, to his marriage to Martha, to the difficulties he had in writing it, and how he uses his characters and his own experience to ask questions about our human world. Those who have the courage to follow Musil's example, to imagine and examine themselves, to touch their own memories with a surgical instrument, never fail to write fiction that I want to read. Someday I want to teach Musil's diaries together with Kafka's and Thoreau's, for these works are akin and illuminate each other. One characteristic seems to inhere in all three of these writers when they turn to record their private thoughts: discretion. They rarely tell us all their secrets directly. Of the three, Thoreau is the most discreet, but he seemed not to have been at all troubled that his friends, his sister, or Emerson should read his pages. Kafka, as we know, asked Max Brod, his friend, to destroy his journals, but he must have known that Brod would not carry out his instructions. Was it a cat and mouse game Kafka played with himself, a final way to mock his own pretensions? Musil is, I believe, the least discreet of the three, but may never have intended anyone to read his pages. Did he show them to Martha? I hope Genese can answer that question. Why didn't he destroy them? In Musil's diaries, I don't find him often using metaphor directly, though his gift for imagery is obvious, and the language, even in translation, makes his characters vivid. Thoreau uses metaphor with a gift that readers often miss. He tells us that he fell in love with a young spruce tree. He registers the presence of a fearsome nature on the top of Mount Katahdin, a rebuke to Emerson's unruffled confidence in a benign universe. Thoreau populates its bleak, unforested peak with brutal Indian gods, savage divinities appropriate to the summit of the Maine wilderness. He insists at the end of the Concord and Merrimack that God did not fob us off with metaphor, but speak directly. Emerson obviously registered this last knock with shock. While Thoreau's poetry falls flat, his prose at times rivals Shakespeare's soliloquies. They reveal what moves and ails him. He slyly mocks himself as the village idiot or hermit that the polite citizens of Concord imagine he is. Kafka embraces metaphor throughout his stories and novels, but his journals and letters are also filled with piquant observations and secrets that he seems to want us to guess. In the new translation of his journals, I found what I read as a confession to a night when he has indeed slept with his fiancée, Felice Bauer. For the next day, he's lamenting coitus, talking about the impossibility of anyone marrying him. What's characteristic is the parable of depressed afterthoughts. Kafka can brutally discuss his fiancée Felicia's face, but not her body. He has no scruples when it comes to the private parts of the whores he's observed in Prague's brothels, he excludes any direct association with his identity as a Jew in his fiction, but his journals are the opposite. As he approaches his slow suffocation in life, his letters and journal pages reflect his growing need to identify as a Jew. He studies Hebrew, Talmud, dreams about coming back from the desert into Canaan, where he'll live with his final love, Dora Diamond. In a comic trope of desperation, he writes, I'm going to cite this at length just to contrast him with Musil. He writes that he is, quote, another Abraham, one who certainly wants to carry out the sacrifice properly and in general correctly, senses what the whole thing is about, but cannot imagine that he is the one meant. The repulsive old man and his dirty boy. He does not lack the true faith. He has this faith. He wants to sacrifice in the proper manner. If only he could believe that he was the one meant. He's afraid that he will, to be sure, ride out as Abraham and his son, but on the way will turn into Don Quixote. The whole world will laugh itself sick over him. But it's not the ridiculousness itself that he fears. He chiefly fears that this ridiculousness will make him still older and more repulsive, his son dirtier, more unworthy to be really summoned, an Abraham who comes unsummoned. Kafka will show himself in 100 shabby costumes, but about Felicia Bauer, even Julie Warsack, despite his condescension to their looks, he remains discreet. About the final two women in his life, Milena and Dora, despite a flood of letters, he maintains a distance with the former and only lives out a fantasy with the other. His laughter is his discretion. Thoreau's discretion is absolute, though paradoxically, he leaves a moment-by-moment description of his father dying. He acknowledges his brother's anger in regard to the girl they both courted, but only hints at it in the dreams of both. But about his mother, his sisters, he's silent, even though he has set his way of life against them. And we can only wonder, as his scholars do, whether he's talking about Emerson's wife or Emerson or even his childhood sweetheart when he talks about the friend who turned away from him. What do we know from the sister who survived him? That he was still dreaming about his childhood sweetheart on his deathbed. In that sense, he and Robert Musil share a common eros in their last days. Musil is certainly discreet in his diaries about his wife. Martha, though the degree to which he was intertwined with her almost from the first moment he met her, with the exception of his military service, is in sharp contrast to Kafka and Thoreau's lives with women. At the very beginning of the diaries, Musil, with bitter wit, refers to himself as Monsieur le Vivisecteur. The blatant joke is that he intends to operate upon himself without anesthesia so that he can hear his own screams. In the fiction, he takes the surgical instrument to himself to probe who he is, but the diaries give us the context in which he will do this. We hear him thinking about his mistress, Herma, with whom he lived before he met Martha, but never with the intensity in which he uses his experience with her to write Tonka. In the diaries, we get a rare page in which he lets us hear him overhearing his wife, Martha, undressing. But while this is a moment of powerful intimacy, it's also a mark of his discretion. Whereas the end of the completing of love is a complex and ingenious model of indiscretion. The final one in a series of snapshots in which he seems to have collaborated with Martha so that it is as much her indiscretion as his. His wispy self-portrait in this story, however, puts him in one of Kafka's disguises. When Musil came to the moment when his hero, Ulrich's sister, Agatha, enters The Man Without Qualities, the author was faced with the need for a language and a structure that would allow him to explore a world that existed entirely in his own head, in which he detached himself from the social and political realities that had ballasted its preceding pages. He had to make real the other world into which Agatha and Ulrich would cross into. We have some indication of his intentions as to how he intended to resolve it through the early drafts, which show Ulrich and Agatha consummating a sexual union or fleeing an actual one. I think it's safe to say from his last revisions of The Man Without Qualities that he had not found a satisfactory answer and was still revolving possibilities. But the diary's final pages reveal a clear train of thought. Kafka was plagued with the same problem, but the latest translations of the trial suggest that the killing off of Joseph K. was Kafka's solution. The death of either Ulrich or Agatha never seems within the realm of possibility for Musil. Thoreau's books, The Concord, The Merrimack, Walden, The Maine Woods, Cape Cod, his journals, all return us to Thoreau's family, his home. Musil's The Man Without Qualities, even unresolved, is not hopeless. And I just can't help quoting here Harold Bloom's remark, quoting Kafka, hope? For God, lots of hope. For us, no hope at all. So it's not just Musil, the novelist or essayist, who hypnotizes me, but Musil as a man, as a writer, whose life is bound up with what he writes. It's to the diaries I find myself going to read his final notations. Where was Musil when he wrote the final pages of the diary, or diaries, since there are a number of them? He was aware that the Nazi assault on Russia was meeting real resistance. As a former officer who served on the battlefront, he admired the efforts of the soldiers in both armies. He wondered about the thoughts of the German troops as they recognized that they had real opponents in the Russians and that the struggle was going to be bitter and prolonged. The world was in fragments, just as his novel was. And probably his sexual power and Martha's had ebbed away. But the sexual, the erotic, still held his attention. It no longer seems strange to me that he studied the lovemaking of cats through the windows of his house in Switzerland. The very last pages of Musil's diaries are discreet and indiscreet. In 1940, at 60, he wonders about the number, adding, I have myself the impression that some kind of end is beckoning. It's followed in 1941 in the diaries by a page that Martha was unable to tear up after his death, but sewed into her coat. A morning, companionable, tender in fact, but no coitus. What was it that took place in all those days, through all those years? Where were the beds placed in all those rooms as an unquestionable preamble? Was there no sense of satiety, of surfeit? Sometimes one or two signs of this, but post-coitum. How did the transition take place? At any rate, the marriage that's still intact after decades serves as an example. Few details remain in memory. Those that do remain have become lyrical. The golden fruit of the fig on the white sheet in Martin Luther Street, the greenish-blue blanket beneath it, the black hair on the white pillow in Weisgerber Strasse, the head with black plates one morning at the window, in the next room in Lofa. No doubt about being sexual and erotic people. How does a relationship that is under the influence of sexuality change between youth and old age? What's lost when beauty disappears? What, even in physical terms, is more permanent, even more important than beauty? This calls me back to earlier pages in Zurich, when Musil stares out the window at the lovemaking of cats. Goes on for several pages. Musil planned to stitch it into one of the penultimate moments of ecstatic union between Agatha and Ulrich. In this meticulous observation, tied to his thought, this is really a question. Was this meticulous set of observations tied to his thoughts about Martha, sexual presence? Quote, the big good-natured house cat, striped in 2 milk coffee colors, also in tan and milk froth, a pretty beast, a little faded. She's been a mother several times over. One would estimate her age, if she were a woman, as late 40s. But she's visibly alert to the wiles of her sex. Musil describes how this strange beauty allows a small, dirty, white tomcat to sing and play court to her. And as its observer, Musil seems to fall in love with this older female, even if it is a creature from another world. He feels the power of her frank stare back at him from that parallel reality. Musil registers as vulgar a day later in the diaries the white Tom's futile attempts to penetrate this older beauty, even though she splayed out to receive her, her private parts visible. I cannot help thinking that this is a parable about Martha and Robert, now in their 60s, a suspicion that the pages that follow seem to allude to, as he lovingly calls into memory, the image of Martha at the beginning of their union, lying back on the sheets in the hotels they visited together. I will end on what's probably a dangerous decision. For this far too brief of my love affair with Robert Musil's work, his life, his thoughts, his secrets. What looms before me is the question he left unanswered at the end of his life in The Man Without Qualities. The endings he had played with years before when the novel was sketched out in his imagination and he left drafts of possible conclusions, but no clear choice. I think the answer lies in his very early story, over which he agonized for several years and only with Martha's help brought to completion, as Genese's title signifies, the completion of love. Just as Claudine has to sleep with a stranger to find her completion and to achieve a spiritual union, not just with her new husband, who is a doppelganger for Robert, but with the universe. She has to recall her very first ecstatic completion and pass into a spiritual union with God. So now, with The Man Without Qualities, where Martha and Robert are playing the role of Agatha and Ulrich, sister and brother, Musil must have known that he had to let Agatha draw Ulrich into her bed to make real what was so powerfully imagined and let the drama go wherever the imagination carried it. For when I first met Agatha in the course of The Man Without Qualities, I fell in love with her and waited for her to call Ulrich into her bed, where I and their author could complete our union. I think I'll leave the proscenium and
So I thank the library very much for this invitation, and I'm particularly thankful to Genese for this invitation, which is a great chance to speak on Musil, and at the same time, you will see I will begin with the confession that I had to go a long way to become a reader of Musil, so I'm even more grateful to Genese for this chance to say some words about Musil. When I say that it took me a long time to become a reader of Musil, I'm not saying that I didn't read some of his work early on. So there was certainly the confusion or the troubles of young Törless, this novel about a boarding school for boys, and that I was attracted and confused by the two narratives on mysterious female protagonist, the completion of love, which was my first love, to be honest, about Musil, and the Quiet Veronica too, and both of them newly translated by Genese. In my view, two ultra-modernist works of writing, extremely fine-grained psychologically, but also descriptions and analysis of late Victorian sexuality always connected to violence in Musil's case, but also, in particular in the early novel, very interested in institutional settings like this boarding school and the particular milieu and circumstances in which things are developing. So this was the one corner or the one angle I was fascinated by, this kind of prose which is so fine-grained and descriptive in its psychological analysis that one always is in a danger of losing even the narrative consequence of it. On the other hand, what I loved from early on, from the beginning on, was a much later text and much later narrative, The Blackbird, Die Amsel, a famous one from 1928, a narrative, a triptych constructed almost like a geometrical problem. Only the surface symptom for that is that the characters which narrate these three stories are called A1 and A2. But it's much more than that. It's really a prose which is crisp and precise in a way, and lacks some of these eternal flow which the early prose has, and seems to be in stylistic regards almost the opposite of it. And when I called the early works which one could call late Victorian prose, one could call these 28 narratives maybe an example of what in the German context was called new objectivity, neue Sachlichkeit, and that's very much the atmosphere in which these narratives develop. So I had these two angles, these two ends of Musil, but I always avoided the real Musil, the center, the man without qualities. This enormous work which spans from at least immediately after World War I. I mean, one can trace it back even much before that, but let's say it begins with World War I until his death in 1942. So I guess what made me hesitate really to go into this enormous, huge work is this, in my view, inescapable huge claim it makes on us, this huge demand it makes on the reader, which borders for me, I mean, it's 800 pages, but it depends what you count. It could also be 1,200 pages or 1,500 pages. And to make you read this work has an enormous, even kind of an authoritarian character. At least that's what I was afraid of. And obviously, when we talk about that in this time, other works come to mind which are comparable, which have a similar appeal, and that's obviously Joyce comes to mind, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and Proust's Search of Lost Time. But for Lost Time, but I think there is still a difference, I thought at the time, between Musil's huge novel and these other huge novelistic enterprises. And the difference I saw is that in Joyce's case and in Proust's case, as a reader, you still can hold to particular constructive principles, like scaffolds from which you get some orientation for reading. You know there is the Odyssey. You know this, and this enormous work unfolds against this backdrop of Homer. And in Musil, in Proust, you know that this novel has this self-containing arc. The novel will, in a way, return into itself as into the work of memory. And you don't have anything like that in Musil. In Musil, it's something like, and that was probably why I first thought hesitating about this work, it's like this demand, read on. I mean, you don't really have a chance other than read on. But when, for some circumstantial reasons which are not that interesting, I really began to read The Man Without Quality, I thought I found something different from what I had expected. And I thought that Musil in The Man Without Quality does not demand or does not want you to subject yourself to something like the task of reading. But he much more is telling you, you may follow the meditative and essayistic style of this work. You may follow as the work meditating and essayistically develop its thought while this work unfolds itself in its own speaking. It has in that sense almost a certain kind of theatricality of this talking voice in the novel, and in that way you might say that this work manages to unite in a certain way, on the one hand, this fine-grained psychological work of analysis, and on the other hand, this lucid construction which you find in the later Musil. There's also this kind of new objectivity style in The Man Without Quality. So what I see on the one hand is this enormous stylistic tension of this obsession with detail to an extent that we even forget sometimes the narrative contextuality or cohesiveness, and on the other hand, this very constructive, very rationally constructing the work of art on the other hand. And this tension comes, I think, with the tension or with the two sides of being immensely or unfold an immense empathy with the characters he is talking about, and on the other hand, this extreme, sharp, satirical style he unfolds in the same novel. So this understanding of the tone of the novel, of the going on of the novel, rather as a meditation about things than about a conventional narrating things, I thought that this gave me an opportunity to connect to the man without quality in a totally new way. And to say that again, I mean, you may like this or that work by Musil, but if you don't like the man without quality, you can't relate to Musil at all. So, speaking of these things, I think are still some thoughts about the readability of this novel, but that still doesn't tell us why you read this novel with this huge demand it makes upon us, and what you probably have to answer is the question: what do you think what the place in the history of the novel of this novel is, and why it is important to read this novel in order to understand something like the idea of the European novel. At least I'm convinced what Musil really felt, what he was doing. And my witness, or the one I'm calling for help to answer this question for me or with me, is a German philosopher, Hans Blumenberg, a philosopher who wrote his work until after the Second World War. And he wrote a particular essay I'm referring to after 45, an essay called The Concept of Reality and the Possibility of the Novel. This is a short piece he wrote in the 60s. That's the time when in German-speaking countries, but also in France and then in the US, Musil was kind of rediscovered, and in particular the Man Without Quality was rediscovered. And when you hear the title of this essay, Concept of Reality and Possibility of the Novel, the title already reads like a Musil quote, and Bloomberg was an indebted and an eager reader of Musil. So that is a piece about the novel and its place in European thought, which is in a certain way dedicated to Musil. Now, give me a moment to trying to explain what Bloomberg tries to say. For him, the definition of the idea of the novel is not as often in the context of the British novel. It's not about the reality and its depiction, but it's about the unfolding of a possibility of reality, of a possible reality, or even more precisely, of the possibility as reality. And the title, as I said, Concept of Reality and the Possibility of the Novel, reads like a quote from Musil, who famously in his novel speaks about, if there is a sense of reality, then there has to be a sense of possibility. Now, to understand where Bloomberg is going and why I think that is a particularly interesting discussion of the novel is that ultimately Bloomberg, the philosopher, was not talking about was not talking as, I would say, a literary critic or as someone who wanted to talk about the novel as a particular literary phenomenon. But what he was interested in and why he referred to the novel was that he was convinced that the novel defines for modernity what we think reality and truth is in the first place. So in this essay, he talks about Plato, he talks about Descartes, he talks about Husserl, about all these philosophers. But when it comes to understand what the essence of the modern idea of truth and reality is, he referred for once in this essay to a literary phenomenon as the key for understanding what reality is, and that is the novel. And his definition of that reality, of this specifically a modern reality for him, is a reality which is not defined by here is a phenomenon and there is an idea to which it is adequate. Here is the phenomenon and there is the thing in itself to which the phenomenon is adequate. No, the understanding of reality in modernity for him is the understanding of the coherence of phenomena. Phenomena which are in a certain way coherent and cohesive among themselves under certain conditions we can accept or not accept. So reality becomes premised on the possibility of things being real, and that is a definition which this is the idea of reality which he sees beginning to determine what thinkers and scientists since the 17th, 18th century took for reality. And in that sense, the novel, even if he was not primarily interested in the literary phenomenon, the novel became, so to speak, the key for understanding reality in the modern sense to begin with. And quoting in a certain way Musil at this point as the one who wrote the novel, where the novel premises itself on its own possibility, became, so to speak, made Musil the hero eponymous, so to speak, of modernity itself. Before I read a small passage from The Man Without Quality to explain a little bit how I understand this thought, let me say one more word about this essay by Hans Blumberg, and that is that although I have said that Blumberg refers to Musil throughout, implicitly throughout his essay, by just saying its reality is encapsulated in its own possibility. Although that's the case, when there are several lines where he actually talks about Musil, and then he does not say that Musil is the example for it, but he says he is, so to speak, to call it with Genese's translation of the completion of love. It's the completion of the novel, and in a certain way also the end of the novel. And he calls this end of the novel the end of the novel in description. The idea is that if it is true that the real is embedded in its own possibilities and in the play of its own possibilities, then every narration turns always into its description of its own narration. So I will read one passage which I always admired very much. It's from the very beginning of the novel, and usually people quote the first chapter, the famous car accident, but I will quote the second chapter, which leads us from the car accident on the streets of Vienna, led by a fictive couple, and one can say much about that. Their fictitiousness is very particular fictitiousness, because the narrator gives them names of characters who will later appear in the novel, but those characters we see coming from the car accident are not those people. So it's an extreme, delightful play of fictionality. And here comes the quote, and it's the quote about the man without quality, as he's called. It will be Ulrich. We don't know already that it's Ulrich. And we see him in his own house, standing behind the window and observing people on the street. He was standing behind a window, gazing through the fine green filter of the garden air to the brownish street beyond, and for the last 10 minutes he had been ticking off on his stopwatch the passing cars, trucks, trolleys, and pedestrians whose faces were washed out by the distance, timing everything whirling past that he could catch in the net of his eye. He was gauging their speeds, their angles, all the living forces of mass hurtling past that drew the eye to follow them like lightning, holding on, letting go, forcing the attention for a split second to resist, to snap, to leap in pursuit of the next item. Then, after doing the arithmetic in his head for a while, he slipped the watch back into his pocket with a laugh and decided to stop all the nonsense. If all those leaps of attention, flexing of eye muscles, fluctuations of the psyche, if all the effort it takes for a man just to hold himself upright within the flow of traffic on a busy street could be measured, he thought, as he toyed with calculating the incalculable, the grand total would surely dwarf the energy needed by Atlas to hold up the world. And one could not then estimate the enormous undertaking it is nowadays merely to be a person who does nothing, to be a person that does nothing at all. At the moment, the man without qualities was just a person. And what of a man who does do something? So what I find so fascinating and exemplary in this passage is that you first think there is a clear framing. We have an observer observing people on the street, and he gauges their attention they have to spend in order just to survive the daily traffic. But then you realize that the problem is that the same kind of attention is needed for him to measure the attention of these people. He may be one of these passengers on the street himself. It's not clear. What is the frame and what is the framed? Who is the observer and who is the observed? It's not that it's unclear, but it's reversible in itself. And I think this reversibility is what makes the novel in a certain way into a description of its own. It always describes its own possibility. And if I would have to come up with a formula for what I see Musil explaining to us, you saw in the quote that he says, um, 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 at the moment, this is what it takes to be a person who does nothing at all. I mean, they are just surviving on the street. They are not acting in that sense, which we today often use when we speak of agency. It's not a moral agency. It's not a political agency. It's just what you have to do in order to survive. And in that sense, I would say what Musil really is giving us is this ultimate description of what it takes to survive, and what it takes to survive, so to speak, in the infrastructure of agency, not of the agency itself, but for everything which is required so that you can act in the first place. And that is, for me, where Musil, as this author of the possibility of reality, becomes the author, or is the author of his novel. Okay, thanks.
Whoa. Well, so going last, I mean, it's a real Musilian problem that I prepared some things, but of course now the world is different. Both of these talks have made me think about things in a different way, and it's sort of, one of the reasons why Musil, never finished the book, because it's this radical experiment of what he called at one point the utopia of the next step, which is that you don't know the value of anything until you see what it brings in its wake. And so it's scary, to sort of be there without the scaffold, the kind of scaffold that Rüdiger was talking about, and to go into this world that Mark is talking about, that that is open and unfixed and unfinished. And, so you can prepare things, but then it's not alive. And so for Musil, it was very important that things were alive. And being alive meant existing in uncertainty and without safety. And so, I was going to thank you all for coming here. I still want to do that. And thank the Society Library and Sayre and Nicholas Burns and Rüdiger who graciously agreed to come when, we hadn't even met. I just reached out to him out of basically nowhere. And Mark, I was going to talk about how the work we've done together, but he already sort of talked about that. But that Burton Pike introduced us when Mark was working on the diaries, and because I was writing about Musil's mysticism, and we shared that interest, which I think is really, as Mark's talk showed, is really an interest in the living connection between art and life. Religious thought and the erotics of language, the spirit that's in the flesh. And the other thing that I was going to say is that, we couldn't stop, none of us could really stop working on Musil. Burton, myself, Mark, we just kept being interested in him. And at one point, Musil says that one of the definitions of genius is inexhaustibility, that you just like Shakespeare, you just keep finding more and more. And I think that, that we kind of have to keep going is proof of that Musil was a sort of genius. Reiner of Contramundum had the madness and energy to say yes to, this was our first book that we did, Thought Flights, and since then we've done 4 books, and I think the mission of Contramundum Press is well aligned with Musil's, and which I would define as an inquiry in how to live in the world when the horizon of values, as Nietzsche's madman said, has been wiped away by a sponge. How to find a conduct of life that doesn't replace old certainties with new rigidities. That's the important part. And it's a resistance. So how to live in the discomfort of complexity and uncertainty. And art was this realm where you could do that. Art was a realm of play, of ethical freedom, and a tool for shattering preconceptions and for continual incitement to rebirth. So it's not an easy place to be. Art, in Musil's words, preserves the not yet completed part of man, that incitement to an unfolding in the midst of conflagration. Musil was a scientist, and he understood that the brain naturally finds commonalities and creates categories. And that a certain thought economy, in Ernst Mach's terminology, is not only necessary, but that it brings meaning and beauty into the world. So we create these patterns, it's useful, it's necessary, and it's art, and it makes us feel alive. However, he was very careful not to let those forms ossify into what he called congealed metaphors, dead, unalive, dead, unalive things, right? And so he strove to have open, creative, shifting ethics, which is very different from a conforming, repressive morality. Ethics is something that you discover for yourself individually, always new, always different. Art was for him a realm of the special case. So even though we have these repeated patterns, art was the place where the individual unique case could be explored. And so Mark was talking about the outsider stance of the Jew and how Musil related to that as a writer. Indeed, that connects, I think, to Zimmel's idea of the Jew as the outsider, as someone who, it's a privileged position in one sense, that you don't conform. You don't have to be part of the conformity because you're by necessity outside. And he saw the woman was like that, the writer was like that, the fool. In his essay on stupidity, he talks about that a lot. Since we're celebrating the books, so we did Thought Flights first, then I think it was Reiner's idea to do Theater Symptoms, which is a book collecting Musil's drama reviews and his theoretical writings on theater, his amazing plays and play fragments. Unions, as Mark said, was inspired by his question about the older translations of these books. And then the last book that we've done is Literature and Politics, which I actually started translating back in the 90s. And it is about Musil's attempts to bear witness to the rise of totalitarianisms. And I think its increasing relevance to current conditions compelled Reiner to want to publish it last year. So I'm going to read a little bit from this book and then just a tiny little bit from the last book. So we'll have the first and the last. So the first piece I'm going to read is called P.A. and the Dancer. And P.A. is Peter Altenberg, who was this sort of famous cafe feuilletonist, flaneur of the time. And this book, so of course all the books I've translated are not The Man Without Qualities, they're other works. And this book is made up of prose pieces that had never been translated before, that had never been collected together before. And so this one is about sort of a mind wandering while listening to a presentation, like many of your minds may be wandering. So I thought it was relevant. So we'll start with that. Okay, P.A. and the Dancer. A lady in the fourth row could not find a way to end her private conversation. A young gentleman behind her leaned forward and backward impatiently, and for a change of pace from left to right as well. But the dancer, who read aloud from P.A.'s books, had already spoken the word noble 12 times and the word exceptional 8 times when the lady thought of one more important thing to say and then finally became silent. After that, there was a general moment of silence. Then another inattentive mood rose slowly to the surface. Even the young man who had listened with an amiable expression became annoyed. She cannot recite, he thought. Then, she honors Peter Altenburg with ceremonial formal German like a serving maid who has a fancy lover. Like a serving maid? Like a modest, good little serving girl, P.A. would say. Oh well. But then she danced. And she certainly did not perform a critique of pure reason with her legs, or the footnotes to Diehl's Den Fragmentis Veterorum Stoicorum, and her thighs did not elucidate the darkest spiritual uncertainties as Duncan's do. Instead, she danced more cabaret. She had a splendid costume, dulcet movements, and beautiful legs. Her legs sometimes appeared from behind her garments as the legs of performers appear in the opening underneath the curtain of a circus tent. Heart-thumping, a fleeting scent, loosened hair, green velvet, gold trim. But really, the scent was the most powerful part. The scent. When one opened the trunk with Mama's and Sister's winter clothes, and this passage, this thing about Mama's and Mama's trunk comes up over and over again. It was obviously a really intense experience for him. So when one opened the trunk with Mama's and Sister's winter clothes, the same scent arose along with the darkness that bedazzled one's eyes. One had to run away, lie down in it, steal something. One wanted to be a little stable boy or to go after this smell that receded into irreality like a growling gorilla with swinging arms. Only then could one make out the well-known friendly frills and skirts, perspiration shields, and fur pieces. Then the man's thoughts acquired a philosophical tumescence. Longing? What was it like? Sometimes I have longed for a glass of water, but when I really longed deep down for a beloved, I didn't really want one. I did not suddenly see a new goal. I saw no goal at all, but I was saturated by a stronger, more masterful, foreign kind of expectation, like a room so radiant that one believes something must enter it. One feels a wonderfulness of receptivity toward no real thing that exists, no real thing that one could receive. The dancer slowly beckoned his memories into his limbs, like a hot lamp softly humming. The one with the scent and the thumping heart came from a circus in the city of Steyr in Upper Austria. Back then, he was a little fellow and could not grasp that such wandering people could lead a regular family life. And when the town dignitaries returned the greeting of the principals on the street and even remained standing with them, he was thrilled by their incomprehension. But in the meantime, he had bored through to the unimaginable. In the back, in the makeshift walls of the circus, he had secretly cut a hole, and only when it let him see into the stable and not the dressing room did his courage fail him, and he hadn't dared to make a second one. But then he rooted out a cave in the city woods and actually sat inside it, thought about the marvelously beautiful Blanche, who was below in the city at that time, with loosened hair, in green velvet on her white horse, practicing jumps for the evening. And he fiercely gripped a deer antler in his pocket, ready for anything that might come. But the next memory was from a restaurant called Casino in a medium-sized city. It was part of the cabaret, had little rooms decorated in white and gold with red carpets. Habitués, regulars, took their dinners there, quiet, friendly, on their way out. But the fact that they stayed there to the last, gently and courtly, even taking the time to pause for a tender smile at their escorts in the doorway, was what drew him every week to this little casino where he spent all his pocket money on a fine dinner that he devoured all by himself. How was it done? I want you, singer, dancer, trapeze artist. You already know how and what for. But listen, I don't mean to make any mere declarations of love. I don't want to throw myself away. I know how you are. I want to have you with as little euphemism as possible, for you are wonderfully beautiful, dark. But don't think for a moment that I don't know how you are to be attained. One pays for a dinner, promises a jewel, and says, allons, allons, one says, and already you know. For an elite connoisseur, this is the only way that your beauty becomes the glorious abysm that it is. But how is it possible for one to smile tenderly without suddenly crying out from being in love and without begging you, despite everything, to just stay sweet? But not one of them understood him. They sat together, spoke of agents and venues, or read the ads in the trade papers. A front man who can perform a good somersault sought. Alto needed at the 12 Sisters. It is a profession, an honest profession, and if one accepts an invitation once in a while, why shouldn't one be really gay for once? That every night one has to say or do something indecent on the stage, really, what do you have against it? What can you be thinking? The people fly to such things as to sugar. Little man, even if somebody blames us, what do you want from us, anyhow? Then the young man's thoughts strayed again. As long as the widow is not thrown on the pyre, there are graduated differences. Whether one is the life partner of a new man every night, or for 3, 5, 15 years, or just being able to consider that it could be nice, and ourselves, when Camilla A dies or betrays us, we come down with peritonitis from heartache, and when Camilla B comes along, we are masters of shameless forgetfulness once again, and in fact are actually truly pure and untouched. When the dancer read something aloud again, the young man's earlier inconclusive thoughts about P.A. became very vivid. It occurred to him, P.A. was a great writer. But we must speak of a phenomenon that becomes increasingly clearer in this writer who has gradually been left behind. The more that he retreats from us, becomes less nuanced, more stereotyped, the more sharp his contour becomes, surrounded by a bright halo, like people in front of an evening sky. If we turn around, we see him like that on a distant chain of hills, walking back and forth, always here and there over the same distance, with an almost incomprehensible lack of weariness, but distinguished by that bright, bright halo. His heights are called the hills of goodness and are 1,908 years closer, in any case, than the last ones of the same name. He will never leave them again, or manages a small apothecary there, Grillin's laxative to induce a soft, exhilarating stool. Decoctions from the tree of life for little girls who have gotten into trouble. Flowers for melancholics, little primitive hourglasses for the all too frolicsome ones. He heals the soul with 100 genuflections and the body with encouragements. He calls this awakening the life energies. He is at his best when he is laughed at. If a girl says to him, "Be nice, Peter, the Baron wants to come to see Paula tonight. Sleep for just once in the servants' room." Then Peter, like the wise dear elephant, like the earnest, considerate tapir, follows the wonderfully beautiful, noble girl and lays himself down on the servant's bed. "If it was a help to you," he says the next day to Paula. But if another one says, "Get lost, Peter, you're a dish rag, not a man," he gathers up his soft organs, lifts up his eyes to her once more, and leaves. Leaves, and soon stumbles again over his soul's intestines, drags them along, hears laughter, gathers them up into himself again with a patient gesture, and continues on. Continues, nobly sad and ridiculous, legendary, and with a face quite similar to our own, a Christ with a pince-nez of horn. This occurred to the young man about the remarkable and beloved P.A. while he wandered through his writings. Why? He didn't know. It would have been much more tender if he had not had all of that other business weighing on him, for which reason he finally became terribly out of sorts and devoted himself somewhat sadly to the little dancer all the more. But now, not only because she danced wonderfully, but also because she read so poorly and made P.A. small with her anxious efforts. A languorous longing rose in the air. This longing, he felt, is like the half-illuminated circus when one comes too early for the show. Blanche will appear. Blanche will smile. Blanche will accept the invitation of the Hair District Commissioner. She will be laid down at night in the great empty circus where only a gas-lit star burns. And when one opens the door, she will smell enchanted, like the clothes in Mama's chest. And even at home, when he looked at the room in which he sat in the mirror and found it a bit unreal, he said to himself, one ought to follow that trail more often. Feelings that have never become real, sudden, reckless flashes. What was that like back then, and even an hour ago? One ought not forget such things immediately. Then he thought of how he had seen Blanche one more time. It was the only kiss that she had ever given him on the way to the train station in Leoben. He had been 15 years old. Blanche was already somewhat gaunt in the face. "We are going away tomorrow, away from Europe," she said, "to Spain." Okay. Now, I have a very strong longing for some water. Could you pass me that glass, somebody? It's a real longing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to read one more little piece from this and then a tiny little bit from literature politics, just a tiny little bit. So this is called Philosophy of a Shoe Factory. And actually, I'm going to skip the very first part. We standardize. For older readers who grew up before we were standardized, an explanation is required. In industrial terms, standardization means that everything that can be made uniformly just as well as it can be made differently is made in the same unified way by all factories. That has great advantages, clears away a completely pointless disorder, cheapens and makes life a pleasure. If one wants to change the ink ribbon of a typewriter, one no longer has to search for a brand of typewriter equipment, for all typewriters will have ribbons of the same width and length. And if one loses the rubber on a pedal of one's bicycle, one will no longer find 400 different kinds of pedal rubber advertised at the bicycle shop, among which precisely the one you want is missing, the one that you have in an isolated exemplar on the second pedal. A great number of things are already being standardized: screws, fittings, apertures, armatures, construction parts for pipelines, hospital supplies and laboratory apparatus, tools, luggage, and a great deal more. We stand at the beginning of a great spiritual movement, which the Renaissance cannot rival. It should thus be permissible to make a few preliminary predictions about a time when the standardization movement will refer not only to products, but to people. There can be no question that the standardized person will have many advantages when compared to the unstandardized. But despite the fact that great attempts to attain this goal are being undertaken, needless obstacles still stand in its path. Let us start by asking ourselves, what will the standardized person look like? He will be interchangeable. Since today all beautiful people are thin here, but fat in the Orient, the accommodation of nature to the average diameter can be assured. The same thing can be said of the standardization of specific degrees of height, which the ready-to-wear industry will require of parents. The Japanese already breed large, oily wrestling types alongside the dry, squat jiu-jitsu types by means of special diets. Man will change through his clothes every quarter of a year, but will always look the same. That has almost already been attained today. The need for luxury can easily be stereotyped by prescribed levels of workmanship, just like the tax rate, and in a very refined society, one's rank can be symbolized satisfactorily by a price tag that reveals that one paid 3 times as much for one's suit, even though it is the same suit. These are simple problems, but are not the good person, the moral, the normal, the useful person? Aren't the ideal patriot, the ideal disciplined party member, the perfect citizen, already standardized people? Visions of the future are herewith opened up for all standardizing institutions. Just what they have always done, they will now do with the aid and the unquestioned authority of science and technology. The current of the times is moving in a direction that serves their purpose. The last vestiges of the individual are polished away. Love, this ancient forest of eccentricity, will become an utter embarrassment. Who today can still say, you, only you, with a good conscience? Everyone knows that the correct formulation is you typical one. Okay. One more bit. So that may seem silly, but this last little bit, which is from Literature and Politics, is a description of this new Nazi terminology called Gleichschaltung, and he tries to explain what that could possibly mean, and I think you will recognize that it is something that we are dealing with today quite a bit. But so the basic translation, gleich means same, Schaltung is like a way of shifting things, so it's about shifting things into conformity. So this is written like in the late 30s. It just in his notebooks. Gleichschaltung, another measure of the strangeness of what is happening today with the German spirit is that a word has come into usage for a large part of these happenings, a word that presents the native speaker with no less difficulty than it does a foreigner. Schalten, the action word at its foundation, belongs to the older history of the German language and had possessed in the present day only a weakened life, so that there were indeed many derivations of it in use, while it itself was somewhat petrified and only used in specific combinations. So one can say, for example, that someone schaltet frei, disconnects or isolates from something. But the simple sentence, one schaltet, no longer carries a complete meaning. On the whole, the word is most often seen in the formula schalten und walten, which means something to the effect of to manage and to have a free hand, but which is spun with a bit of poetical moss. One grasps that there is some romanticism behind the idea of using the word schalten. Its original meaning signifies to push, tow, set in motion, force. This romantic word has the most modern of children. A shelter is something at the train station, namely a ticket office, and something having to do with electrical room lighting signifies a little window that one can push open and close. But there is also in an electrical power station something called a large schaltboard, and then he talks about a legal case, and then he says, every feeling, every uninhibited person is radical. And then he tries one more time to define the word, Gleichschaltung. It marks the strangeness, it will be difficult for foreigners to understand it, of what is happening today in Germany, that this word Gleichschaltung, which plays such a large role in it, cannot be directly translated into other languages. This word was suddenly there, one day out of nowhere, for the not yet National Socialist Germans. Lamps, machines are gleichgeschaltet, switched into conformity, and Germans. Difference between norms and similarities. It has active and passive meanings in psychiatry, levers and similar mechanisms, electric currents, ein- und ausschalten, switch on and off, Schaltwerk, control unit, Schalthebel, switching lever, in general, Gleichstrom, co- or parallel current, a current whose direction remains the same, so on and so forth. I'm just going to skip a little bit. Schalten, Middle High German, to push, tow, especially a ship, into movement, to force. In New High German becomes to steer. Old High German schalten, to push. New High German schalter, sliding sash, window. From Middle High German schalter, bolt. Schaltjahr, leap year. Already in Old High German because of the day that is shoved in. To shove is also a basic meaning of schalten. Walten really means to be strong. See Gewalt, violence. Incorporating of the Verwalten, the powers, administration. Permeation with National Socialist spirit and National Socialist form. And then he has, every once in a while in his notebooks, he has put a border around something. So this is one he's put a border around, and he says, the writer speaks. I was never partisan. I was always on my own. I have done my duty, but now they want to keep me from doing it. That is why I am here. Okay.